Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And we are starting today's National House campaign call. As many of you know, our National House campaign focuses on advancing the anti-racist policies and achieving the large-scale, sustained investments that are needed to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable, accessible place to call home. We launched this campaign several years ago because we recognized that more than ever, we needed bold policies to ensure that people with the lowest incomes and those who are the most marginalized have a stable, affordable, accessible home. And on our call, we have folks from across the country, advocates, homeless shelter providers and service providers, housing providers, resident organizers, people with lived experience, including low-income individuals who might be receiving or in need of federal housing assistance, people with experiencing homelessness, philanthropy, and media. So we have a large number of people from across the country who are joining with us today for our call, which is really focused on the intersection between climate change and housing. It's a pressing issue that all of us know is going to become even more important as climate change worsens, as it puts more low-income people and communities, particularly communities of color, at risk. I also know that this is an issue that is top of mind for many coalition members. We did a recent member survey, and we heard really loud and clear from many of you that you wanted to know more about the work that NLHC does in this space, wanted to know more about the connection between environmental justice and housing justice. And so we planned this call for you as a sort of a 101, as a primer to get to know a little bit more about the disaster housing recovery issues that are out there, what are the challenges, and what are the solutions, hearing largely from people with lived experience of going through a disaster. So I want to thank everybody for joining on our call today. We are going to hear from both Noah Patton and Megan Martyris, who help lead NLHC's work in this space on disaster recovery and resilience. We're going to hear from Whitney Bailey from Apple Red Legal Aid, who's going to share about some of the challenges that she has seen in addressing disaster recovery issues. We'll hear from Andronika Morris from Housing Louisiana and a longtime disaster equity advocate who will talk a little bit about grassroots efforts near her. And we'll share more about the policy solutions that are needed to ensure a complete and equitable recovery for the lowest income and most marginalized disaster survivors. So it's going to be a really great agenda today. Before we turn it over to our speakers, I just wanted to remind everyone, one, you can introduce yourself in the chat box. We'd love to know who you are, where you're from, maybe why you're focused on this issue. And then if you have questions, you can enter them into the Q&A box today. It's a lot easier for us to track questions that you have for our speakers if you use that Q&A box. We'll probably get to questions at the end of today's call. And then lastly, as a reminder, we're going to send a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation and any of the materials that our partners or speakers mention. We'll share that with you in the coming days so that you have all of the resources that you need. And with that, we will get our program started, and I'll turn it over to Noah Patton, who leads our disaster housing recovery work at the Coalition. Noah.
Hello, my name's Noah Patton, Manager of Disaster Recovery here at the Coalition, and I'll just say ask and you shall receive. So we're doing disaster housing recovery today and have an excellent lineup of speakers, as Sarah mentioned and talked about. So just a brief primer on how NLHC looks at and approaches our disaster recovery work. So you might remember from previous calls, we've always had a disaster housing recovery coalition, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, but we've recently expanded our efforts to kind of encompass different aspects of disaster recovery. So we're calling this our DHR 3, or DHR for short, um, campaign here. So under this kind of the new banner and hat of the disaster housing recovery research and resilience effort here, we have our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, our Disaster Housing Research Consortium, which is headed up by our research team and includes researchers as well as community members working around researching the impacts of disasters, as well as kind of resilience efforts, as well as a specific resilience focus, one that is a bit more proactive. I feel like with disaster, responding and recovering from disasters is kind of by nature a very reactive process, or a reactive effort. And so we've, through this kind of restructuring, we've decided to kind of highlight and emphasize working in the resilience space, which of course is like working prior to a disaster to lessen the impact of a disaster and make sure that our communities are strong enough to withstand both disasters as well as ongoing climate change and those impacts. So I will take the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, group of over 900 local, state, and national orgs working to ensure that all disaster survivors receive the assistance that they need to fully recover. We kind of started this in 2017 after Hurricanes Harvey and Hurricane Maria in Texas and Puerto Rico, respectively. And it has since kind of grown out into this kind of nationwide network of groups working in the disaster recovery and resilience space. So it's a wide-ranging group with legal aid partners, housers, homeless service advocates, homeless service providers, housing developers, community groups, people working in the environmental justice space, scientists, scholars, researchers, and all of the above. And so kind of through this network, we provide, federal advocacy support, which, fits in very well with NLIHC's ongoing federal advocacy, as well as kind of information sharing across different disaster impacted areas, letting folks know in, Northern California what's going on in Florida, as well as kind of direct technical assistance. Because with this nationwide network, we have a large amount of expertise and knowledge. And so part of the goals of the DHRC is making sure that we're, cataloging that knowledge and making it available to groups in disaster impacted areas. We additionally do some advocacy support. That's, the last thing you kind of want to do, the last thing you want to do in the immediate aftermath of a disaster is sit through a House Financial Services Committee hearing. And so we gladly fall on that sword for our partners working in disaster impacted areas. And we can also provide direct advocacy support for local and state level asks and campaigns, kind of lending our advocacy expertise to those efforts. So, it's a lot of angry letter writing and so on and so forth, but it seems to work. And I think all the groups that are involved in the DHRC are find it very useful, if I do say so myself. And I know, we have some DHRC members on the call today, so thanks again for your continued support and work. Take the next slide. Cool, yeah. So for those that aren't members yet, you can become a DHRC member. It costs no money. You can just use the link in the chat box to sign your organization up and be listed as a member of the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, and just show your support for our work kind of in the disaster recovery space, work that you're going to be learning about today. In addition, we have a long-running Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition working group that meets every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time from now until the end of time. And you don't have to be a DHRC member to join those, but you can register and kind of share out about what you're seeing in your area, learn learn how disaster recovery efforts are going in places around the country, as well as pose questions and get answers to questions you might have around disaster housing recovery. I think that is about it. And I'll just kind of close by saying um, I think we all kind of are seeing increased disaster impacts, increasing, climate change induced disasters coming down the pipe. And I think as housers and people working in the housing space, it is pivotal for us to be prepared for what is going to be coming and what is already occurring across the country in terms of weather and climate change impacts. So I think we're kind of the front lines for all of that stuff when really the rubber meets the road. And so I think having a articulated policy in response to disasters and climate change influenced disasters is kind of a central part of our mission. And I view it as kind of inseparable to the broader work that the coalition is doing. So I hope, this presentation spurs you to get involved and start thinking about how your mission in your town, in your county, in your state kind of involves disaster recovery and what you can do to make sure that your community is prepared for future impacts of disasters. And with that, I think I will pop it back over to Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Noah. That was really a helpful overview. I hope folks take you up on your offer and sign up to join the DHRC if they're interested, or start participating if they want to learn more. And with that, we're going to turn it over to some of the deeper content here about disaster recovery. For that, we're going to turn it over to Megan from the coalition, who's going to share a little bit more about what you need to know about the short-term disaster recovery process and working with FEMA. So for that, I will turn it over to Megan. Thanks for joining.
Cool. Thanks, Noah, and thanks, Sarah. And hello, everyone. So my name is Megan Martires. I'm a disaster housing recovery analyst here at NLIHC. And I'm also a Superstorm Sandy and Hurricane Ida survivor. So today we're going to chat about the federal government and how it responds to, or sadly often fails to respond to, the housing needs of disaster survivors when a disaster occurs. And we're going to have a particular focus on those with the lowest income and from the most marginalized groups, since these are the folks who bear the biggest burden after disaster, but have the least resources to recover. So jumping right in, there are two phases to disaster recovery: short-term and long-term recovery. And before I go into explaining the timeline of how the government responds to disaster, I want to note that this timeline is based on how things are supposed to work in theory. So in practice, this system often works against disaster survivors instead of for them. And I'll explain how it fails to meet the needs of disaster survivors after we all have a baseline understanding of how the process is at the very least supposed to go. So we're going to start with short-term recovery. And short-term recovery begins immediately after the disaster has passed. So think like your favorite action movie when the disaster aid workers arrive, but way more chaotic and bureaucratic than the movies portray. And at this stage, the state will be doing damage assessments where community members will report the amount and the kind of damage they experience from the disaster to the state. And then the governor will use this information as justification to request a disaster declaration from the president. So you need a federal disaster declaration in order to unlock all forms of federal assistance for disaster survivors. So AKA money from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and the grants from the Housing and Urban Development Agency, or HUD. So once the president approves the disaster declaration, the federal government begins to roll out their aid programs. So FEMA is the federal agency in charge of running most of the short-term recovery programs. And during this phase, survivors can apply for assistance through FEMA, the Small Business Administration, the Department of Agriculture, and other agencies. And under the Stafford Act, which basically is the law that governs how the U.S. does disasters, FEMA has to pack its bags 18 months after the disaster. So this is when we transition into long-term recovery, and survivors begin the process of completing their recovery and stabilizing their long-term housing solutions. And at this point, HUD takes over the reins with their federal government grant program. And we'll talk more about this and long-term recovery in a bit. So next slide, please. So yeah, so now as promised, we're going to take a closer look at how these disaster aid programs actually work. And we're going to start with FEMA. So FEMA runs 3 disaster aid programs, but the main one that directly assists survivors is the Individual Assistance Program, or the IA program. And as you can see on the slide, there are many multiple programs under the IA program. Without going into too much detail, FEMA programs can be used for things like rental assistance, immediate needs like food, clothing, etc., among other things. But like I said, in practice, FEMA aid is incredibly difficult to obtain, typically is not nearly enough money to even address short-term needs, especially for those with the lowest incomes and from the most marginalized groups, and can't be used by individuals experiencing homelessness prior to the storm. So next slide. If you're thinking that makes absolutely no sense, you would be correct. We owe this ridiculous rule once again to the Stafford Act, that law I mentioned earlier that governs how the US handles disasters. FEMA justifies this decision by claiming that since the need for housing was not created by the disaster, they cannot assist those who were experiencing homelessness prior to the disaster. That being said, they can address folks who live in, quote, non-traditional housing, so like tents, huts, etc. Unfortunately, though, once again in practice, this is super hard to actually make happen. So to prove you live in non-traditional housing, you need to get a letter signed by a local official or caseworker attesting to the fact that you lived in a non-traditional structure at the time of the disaster. This is often impossible, and even if a person is able to complete this process, it only ensures that they get 2 months of temporary rental assistance. So I do want to note here that there is a really cool, and going to the next slide, short-term recovery program called the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, or DHAP. And this provides low-income displaced families with safe, decent, and affordable rental homes while they rebuild their lives and get back on their feet. And it also assists survivors with wraparound case management. And if this program was implemented after a storm, it would fill a huge gap by addressing the needs of those survivors that FEMA most often fails. The problem is that lately, FEMA hasn't been using this program in the aftermath of a disaster. Cool. So now I'm gonna pass it to my sorry, Sarah, you go.
Sorry, before we pass along to our next speaker, I'm just wondering if you could answer one of the questions we have, which is about, can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that people have when in their immediate needs? So for example, if you have somebody who has to manage their diabetes, but they're displaced from their home, maybe they don't have other housing, what could the impacts be from the many challenges that you spoke about here with short-term recovery?
Yeah, so in the short-term recovery, when our system fails to catch people, particularly those from marginalized groups, particularly those dealing with disabilities like diabetes you mentioned, those in the disability community are much more likely to die in the aftermath of a disaster than those not in that community. And what we see is folks don't want to necessarily call emergency services because sometimes that leads to institutionalization against their will. So people will stay in unsafe living situations and then get hurt. So that's kind of where we see those folks who are dealing with health conditions. But all folks who have limited resources find themselves in more precarious situations where it's harder to get access to food. You might have not been houseless before, but now you are because the storm has destroyed your house. Things like that as we go into talking about long-term recovery, we're going to see these effects just compound on top of each other and make the situation all the more worse.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thanks for making the connection between sort of the challenges that we see on the short term and how that can make the housing crisis worse, how it can make homelessness worse in our communities if we don't properly address it. So thank you, Megan, for joining. We're now going to turn to Whitney Bailey, who's the disaster response attorney at Apple Red Legal Aid, who's going to share her story that really crystallizes many of the challenges that Megan laid out about what happens with short-term recovery. So Whitney, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, Megan, and Noah, for the invitation to speak today. So my name is Whitney Bailey. I'm the Disaster Response Project Director for Apple Red Legal Aid in Eastern Kentucky. And I am more than happy to share my experience about navigating FEMA's bureaucratic and often inaccessible aid programs. Next slide. Thank you. When Eastern Kentucky was hit with catastrophic flooding in July 2022, 45 people tragically lost their lives and thousands of homes were severely damaged or destroyed. The region was already suffering from a housing crisis before the flood hit, and it encompassed the highest percentage of the state's population living in poverty. Of Kentucky's 120 counties, Apple Red serves 37 counties throughout South Central and Eastern Kentucky. All 13 counties included in the July 2022 disaster declaration were in Apple Red service area. Next slide, please. Prior to joining Apple Red Legal Aid, I didn't have any personal experience with disasters, nor could tell you what the FEMA acronym even stood for. In my first week with Apple Red, I read the Stafford Act, which, as Megan was saying, is the holy grail of law governing how the U.S. does disasters. I also learned about FEMA's Individuals and Households Assistance Program, which provides the financial and direct services to eligible individuals and households affected by a disaster. Next slide. From September 2022 to present, I've exclusively focused on providing legal services to disaster survivors, like submitting FEMA appeal letters, and work to connect our clients with other community partners that are able to assist with ongoing disaster recovery efforts. Clients frequently struggle to provide supporting documentation verifying the disaster's impact on FEMA's timeline due to the lack of availability and accessibility of contractors for an itemized home repair estimate, or because a client was displaced from their disaster damaged home. Next slide. In August 2023, one of my contacts with a nonprofit disaster relief organization, St. Bernard Project, reminded me that by law, FEMA has to end their disaster response and recovery efforts 18 months after the disaster occurs. This means that if you disagree with the decision FEMA has made about your eligibility for assistance, you have to file an appeal within 60 days of receiving FEMA's decision and before the 18-month deadline in order to be reconsidered for more aid. My colleague encouraged me to make sure our disaster survivor clients were aware that they had until January 29th, 2024, or 18 months after the declaration, to submit FEMA appeal letters for additional financial assistance. Next slide. Apple Red began submitting FEMA appeal letters on behalf of all 300+ clients with the understanding that their FEMA application would remain open for 60 days and we could supplement information after the January 29th appeal deadline. I also began contacting community partners and local media partners to inform and urge all disaster survivors to submit FEMA appeals by the January 29th deadline. On January 29th, Apple Red was contacted by multiple media partners questioning the appeal deadline stories. The media partners had been advised by a FEMA spokesperson that we had gotten the facts wrong, there wasn't an 18-month appeal deadline, and that they needed to remove or retract their stories. At the time, I was personally conflicted about how to move forward. Being wrong about my understanding of the 18-month period of assistance was great news for disaster survivors because that meant that they have more time to obtain those contractor estimates and other supporting documentation that would help prove their eligibility and need for FEMA's help. However, Apple Red received numerous client calls and emails in the following weeks stating that FEMA had contacted them in some form to say that their most recent appeal was denied because the disaster was closed and their FEMA application was also closed. They would not have an additional 60 days to work on their case and receive the critical aid they needed for their recovery. Many of our clients were devastated and didn't know how they would continue without the necessary resources to recover. The stories FEMA was telling different people didn't quite add up. In fact, they directly contradicted each other. Next slide. I'd been in contact with Louisville Public Media and NPR reporter Justin Hicks about the deadline situation. I connected Justin with a household who checked all of FEMA's boxes and should have received additional home repair assistance. Justin referred the household to Senator Rand Paul's office and published an article on April 24th, 2024 about their experience and FEMA's appeal deadline. 5 days after Justin's article was published, Senator Paul's office was notified that FEMA had re-reviewed the appeal and awarded the household an additional almost $19,000 for home repairs. Because of FEMA's financial closure, AppleRed has been reviewing all of our FEMA appeal cases and referring disaster survivor clients to Senator Paul's office, who we strongly believe should have been eligible for FEMA financial assistance. Through our referrals, at least 3 additional disaster survivors have been approved for more funding as recently as 2 weeks ago. AppleRed is also working to connect clients with other home repair opportunities, like applying for home repair grants through USDA and completing an interest questionnaire to be considered for the housing program funded by the Community Development Block Grant for Disaster Recovery, or CDBG-DR. While I'm extremely grateful for FEMA's role in the disaster response process and for the other opportunities available through the Small Business Administration, USDA, and CDBG-DR, it's been my experience that FEMA's financial assistance is inconsistently and slowly awarded, and that there's an opportunity to improve communication and increase transparency about deadlines in the future. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Whitney, for sharing that story. It's very clear that you're extremely effective at helping people apply and get the assistance that they need. But what does that tell you about our system if you have to have a legal aid attorney to get the help that you need? How do you think about like that structural barrier?
I absolutely believe that disaster survivors should have the opportunity to be more self-sufficient. It shouldn't be this complicated. It should not be this complicated. I wish I was out of a job, honestly.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm so glad that you're able to join the call today and share your story, and that you're working as part of this larger coalition to try to make it happen so that disaster survivors can get the assistance that they need. So appreciate you joining on the call. Thanks for staying on. With that, we're going to transition a little. We gave you a picture of what's happening on short-term recovery issues. And now we're going to hear a little bit more about the long-term disaster recovery process, the process that's at HUD, and some of the challenges there as well. And so for that, we're going to go back to Megan, who's our MVP of the webinar, who's going to share with us some more information that we need to know. Thanks, Megan.
My thing's being a little choppy. Okay, I think
You're on and we can hear you. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Okay, cool. Yeah, so as Whitney mentioned, and as Sarah's question to me indicated, we're going to see how in long-term recovery, the effects and the setbacks people have experienced during short-term recovery only compound on one another and really result in a lot of people falling through the cracks. So as I mentioned before, once we enter the long-term recovery phase, HUD steps up to the plate with its federal grant program called the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. So really long name, and the acronym is also pretty long. It's CDBG-DR program. From here on out, I will do my best to just try to call it the federal grant program, because that seems a little bit easier. So yeah, if we could go to the next slide. There are 4 pretty general requirements regarding how the federal grant funds can be used. So first, they have to address a presidentially declared disaster impact. Second, anything you do with with those funds has to fall within a CDBG eligible activity. The funds also have to meet CDBG national objectives. And fourth and finally, 70% of total allocations have to go to low and moderate income households, which is really cool. So what does this actually mean in practice? Basically, you can use CDBG-DR funds to construct new housing, reconstruct or rehabilitate existing housing, provide rental assistance, repair infrastructure like bridges, roads, and water facilities, and carry out economic development, which can involve things like job training and business loans. So, as I'm sure you guys can imagine, if we can go to the next slide, a recovery is far from done 18 months after the disaster. And like I said, hypothetically, this is where the federal grant program would come into play. But the grant program isn't actually permanently authorized, which means it is not a permanent program. So every so often, at no regular consistent time, our Congress has to get on the same page and pass one-off disaster aid packages to haphazardly attempt to get recovery money to the families who need it the most. So if we can go to the next slide, because the program isn't permanent, we end up with an extremely lengthy process that results in critical aid not reaching those who need it the most in a timely manner. And requirements for the program are constantly changing because HUD has to rewrite the program's regulations every time Congress passes one of these one-off acts. So there's little oversight regarding how states use the money. The need of renters and individuals experiencing homelessness is really underestimated. And smaller states don't have the capacity to actually administer the grants and make sure people who need the money the most get it in their hands. So if we go to the next slide, this is a timeline that demonstrates just how many complicated steps are required for a state to even access the grant funds. So in order for this grant to actually get in the hands of survivors, Congress has to, again, get on the same page, pass a supplemental spending bill, and send the money to HUD to allocate to the impacted states. And then states have to create an action plan that explains how they intend to use the money and hold a public comment period. Next, the state will take those comments into consideration and adjust their action plans as needed. And after this, the state submits the action plan to HUD for approval. Then HUD either approves or rejects the action plan. And once the plan is approved, HUD signs a grant agreement and states can then access their federal grant funds. So that was a lot, right? And this timeline doesn't even take into account the amount of time it takes a state to get the money out to impacted survivors. So I mentioned I was a Hurricane Ida survivor. Hurricane Ida happened almost 3 years ago. Not a single Hurricane Ida survivor has federal grant funds, even though the state now has the funding in their hands. So if we can go to the next slide, because of these delays, what ends up happening is we turn temporary displacement into permanent displacement, and we turn already existing inequities into even larger issues. Because while delays and insufficient aid hurt everyone, they hit Black, Latino, and Indigenous people, low-income communities, disabled folks, and immigrants with the fewest resources to rebuild the hardest. And so to share, I'm going to throw it back to Sarah so we can hear about an experience of somebody who's really been through this process.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Megan. I feel like if I had this information at my hands when I was starting work on disaster recovery, I would have been a lot better off than sort of the process I had, which was trying to like crawl my way out of it. So thank you so much for that overview. And as you mentioned, we're going to now turn it over to Andronika Morris, who's the executive director at Housing Louisiana, and who's one of the longest running, most effective, most amazing disaster equity advocates that we have. So we're so pleased to have Andronika on today's call.
Sarah, the check is in the mail. I appreciate you as always. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not going to talk for very long. Some of you know me. We've been longtime partners of the National Income Housing Coalition, who I do feel the need to shout out for keeping this kind of engagement and this space available for these kinds of hard conversations, because unfortunately, all too frequently, more and more communities are being joining the fraternity of the disaster stricken. And now with climate change and learning about the pandemic, how far-reaching its impacts are, there's not a community in the United States that hasn't dealt with this in some form or fashion. What I'm going to talk about for a few minutes today is just grounding in how long-term recovery needs to be planned adequately from the beginning. I had some PowerPoints, but we were going back and forth about whether or not I needed to share anything on screen, and we're not going to do that. We are going to talk though about after Hurricane Katrina, or rather hurricanes Katrina and Rita, because people tend to miss the fact that it was 2 hurricanes that hit Southeast Louisiana in the span of about 30 days that led to the disaster that is now known as Hurricane Katrina, and the flooding, the displacement, the loss of life. And the real question about whether or not a great American city could survive and what surviving looked like. And pleased to say we're still here, but it's 19 years later. And it is, and today is an interesting day to be talking about this, because it is the 8th anniversary of the great floods in Baton Rouge, which happened in 2016. And it's indicative of what's happened over the last 19 years, is that hurricanes Katrina and Rita were just the beginning. We have been battered and bombarded with everything from wildfires to winter storms and a myriad of issues that affected our long-term, and of course more hurricanes that have affected our long-term sustainability, and have even made more extreme the challenges that people experienced with hurricanes Katrina and Rita, because the next storm came or the next incident came, and people who had not recovered adequately or sufficiently were set back even further. And that's why long-term recovery has to be the goal with these various programs that we're standing up. We have to be talking about ensuring and guaranteeing success and recovery within a fixed amount of time, because there's something else around the corner that we can prepare communities for. That's also got to be a part of the conversation. And that's what we've learned in the last 19 years, that we can, building technology has increased, and that we can actually use these dollars and bring home and rebuild, but we also have to do so equitably. So the 10 years after Katrina, there was huge amounts of money, because New Orleans was the only, or the hurricanes Katrina and Rita were really all that we were talking about. That's changed dramatically in the last 19 years. Your communities are now getting the same treatment. And so it may feel as though no one gets that same amount of attention, but that's where we have the opportunity to work together. And that's what we learned those 10 years after Katrina, where we brought online 88,000 subsidized housing opportunities, helping homeowners come back, helping first-time homeowners buy, and helping renters find long-term housing opportunities that still exist to this day. Unfortunately, because we didn't go deep enough, we didn't deal with some of the systemic issues that are connected to housing, we now find ourselves almost back at square one, with more people needing assistance after that first 10 years. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary. And what we are seeing now are far too many stories. For example, former public housing residents who were able to buy a home, and because of the insurance crisis that has been impacted, or that has been created because of disinvestment in our communities, they're now selling those homes and going back to public housing. Like in a lot of different ways, we're seeing folks get set back here in South Louisiana, as well as all of Louisiana. The failure to recognize that housing is something that we can provide and can guarantee for everyone, and that we should be doing that, and that in a time of disaster, the investments necessary should not be doled around and spread amongst people, and certainly not spread amongst disaster profiteers and so-called experts in disaster recovery, that we should be putting this money into our communities. And that means into the homes of our friends and neighbors who need it the most. And then it bubbles up. So we have moved in a number of different ways here in Louisiana. We have adopted a put housing first philosophy, where we're working with FEMA, with local disaster officials and local and state officials to try to guarantee housing for all and from a systemic standpoint, and secure additional investment to close the gap using funding sources like the IRA and the IIJA and the COVID relief dollars, making sure that those investments really go down and people are sustainable. People are helped, because we've had again, I could go on and on and on, and I'm not going to because I don't have a whole lot of time with y'all today, because we want to spend more time talking to you, hearing any questions that you might have. But there is one story that I did want to share, another example of how important this is and how critical these needs are. We're still having people who have not recovered from Hurricane Ida, which was about 3 years ago now, and in 2021. And Hurricane Ida, unfortunately, last year we had a tragic outcome with that. We've had people still living without power in their homes, not able to return their homes. And we have now also experiencing extreme cold here in Louisiana. So the best of, or the worst of, both kinds of climate problems. And because of that, you're having more fires, more accidents. And we had a homeowner who was living in her home or staying with family and friends, and sometimes in hotels, but she could not get power restored back to her home. Almost textbook case of an older person who needed support. She had enough money from her first insurance payout to make some repairs to the home. She was swindled by a contractor. So this is an instance where someone where she should have been able to access construction services and supportive services to help her manage these resources. And then when that happened, she was staying with family, she was staying in hotels. She decided to go back to her home. She was worried about crime, and which had her padlocking the home while she was in it, and even when she wasn't there, because she was worried about someone breaking in and taking what little she had left. And unfortunately, the end of this story was while we're having a cold snap, and what we can learn from the fire department is that something had been a candle had been a heating implement was being deployed. The house took a light, and she could not escape the flames. And family who were nearby were there in time to hear, unfortunately and tragically, the screams as the fire department struggled to get into the home, could not get into the home in time, and eventually she lost her life. This is someone that I feel we failed as a community because we know better and we know what's necessary. There's no reason in 2021 or 2022 when she died that we should still be having these conversations. Sorry, 2023 when she died, that we should still be having these conversations about people who've been victimized by disaster. We know what to do, and we need to put the system in place. It's not just about getting the federal resources. That's an incredibly critical component, but our local communities now need to be responsive in a way. We need to have built out the systems that the federal money can go into, the power to kind of wrap around supportive services, as well as the investments in our homes that will guarantee our housing for the long run. And so I'm going to wrap it up at that.
Thank you so much for that, Andronika, and for sharing that tragic story. Just so terrible. I think it really underscores all of the points that you're raising about really the need for all of us to be prepared in our communities, to be thinking now about how we create systems that can better respond to people's needs so that we're not seeing this play out over and over again, as you well know. I appreciate that. Thanks for joining. We're now going to turn to talk a little bit about those solutions. So Both Noah Patton and Megan Matiris from the coalition are going to share a little bit more about what are some of the policy solutions that we see at the federal level. And then I'm hoping that after that, we'll have time to do some Q&A with all of our speakers today, and maybe to learn a little bit more about how we work together to make sure our communities can better respond. So with that, I'll turn it over to Megan.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Andreanika, for coming and sharing that. I think it's important to underscore that as we talk about all of this, that it is really people's lives that are at stake. And so these solutions are things that should have been implemented yesterday. But we're here today, and now Noah and I will go over some of those ways that we really think that you guys can make a difference in terms of disaster recovery. So if we go to the next slide, you may have mentioned, remember that I mentioned that the CDBG-DR program, or the federal grant program, is not permanently authorized. And that's where we see a lot of these inequities being birthed. So the DHRC actually worked with congressional partners to draft something called the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act, or the RDRA. And this is a bill that would permanently authorize the grant program. With the increasing frequency of hurricanes and flooding and extreme weather, we need Congress to establish a better way for communities to access the funding they need and to do so quickly. So the bill does this by doing a few things. So it creates a standing disaster recovery fund that can quickly disperse initial recovery funding to disaster-stricken areas without waiting for congressional approval. It develops a formula to allocate assistance to the most impacted and distressed areas resulting from a disaster. It requires the use of federal recovery funds are balanced between rebuilding infrastructure and rebuilding housing. It ensures that housing funds must be spent proportionally between homeowners and renters. And it requires states to prioritize activities that help extremely low and low to moderate income survivors recover, address pre- and post-disaster housing needs, and prepare for future disasters. And then finally, it maintains the current requirement that 70% of federal recovery funds have to benefit low and moderate income people, and it provides clear direction to HUD on how to actually make that happen. And then it also has provisions that protect civil rights and fair housing, encourages mitigation and resiliency, and prioritizes data transparency and oversight so we can make sure that this money is actually getting into the hands of the people who need it the most. So we could go to the next slide. Lucky for us, the bill does have bipartisan support. So the bill is actually co-sponsored by 8 Democratic and 9 Republican Senate offices and 5 Democratic House offices. But right now, this bill is stuck in Congress, and there just isn't enough momentum to get it through the negotiation processes for past recent legislative packages. So if we could go to the next slide. To help gain momentum in the current and next Congress, NLIHC is creating a national support letter for the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act to convince congressional leadership to move the bill forward as part of any and all upcoming bipartisan legislative packages. And if we want this bill to move, we need at least 500 organizations to sign this letter. Lucky for us, we already have over 300 organizations signed on, but we need your help to get it over the final hump and get to 500. So to sign on, all you have to do is fill out the form I'm dropping in the chat. And if you're not sure if you've signed on, because I've been making a lot of asks to a lot of different folks, that is totally fine. Just fill out the form. We can always take you off if you're a duplicate. And if you already signed the letter and are signing right now, as I hope you are, we still need your help. In order to hit this goal of 500 letter signatures, we're going to have to talk to more folks. And if you know other organizations that would be interested in signing on, please spread the word to them. And feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help you get the word out. Come talk to other organizations. We have a ton of pre-made advocacy tools that can help you get the word out, like pre-written emails, thank yous, fact sheets. Happy to share that with you. And then you can do as you please with that information and getting that out to your networks. And I just want to say, I'm going to pass it to Noah to talk about another solution we'll need your help with. But whatever way you can help, I just also want to personally thank you. As I shared, I'm a survivor of Superstorm Sandy and Hurricane Ida, and I previously worked as a community organizer with folks who are also impacted by those storms. I've seen firsthand what a difference having a bill like the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act would make in communities just like mine. So I just want to say, an early thank you on their behalf and mine for any actions you take. And I hope to engage with you guys more and chat with you more. But yeah, I'll pass it to Noah to talk about the another solution we're working on.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, so number one, everybody should be, I was going to pause there for you to go to the sign-on link that was posted in the chat and then sign on. But as you're doing that, I have one additional thing to talk about as it comes to the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act. So recently, there's a bill. It's HR 1605, which is the Natural Disaster Recovery Program Act, sponsored by Congressman Rouser and Congressman Graves. That bill aims to replace the HUD Long-Term Disaster Recovery Program in favor of an even less transparent and more time-consuming system in terms of getting assistance to the disaster survivors that need it the most. Essentially, the bill would basically appoint FEMA as the chief long-term disaster recovery agency, and the funds would be provided to FEMA that would then just pass it directly on to state governments with little to no control over how those funds get used, who gets those funds after disasters, whether those funds are targeted for housing or a myriad of other disaster recovery topics. And so that creates a situation where we'll have two competing long-term disaster recovery programs, which will make it even messier and even less likely to get long-term disaster recovery funding out the door. So there is going to be a markup next month in the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which oversees FEMA's kind of disaster recovery programs. So we're inviting everybody to join us in calling and emailing GOP members of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee to urge them to oppose HR 1605 and say that instead you would like Congress to advance the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act to permanently authorize HUD's long-term disaster recovery program and improve it to ensure that those funds are reaching those most in need of assistance following disasters. So you can also remind remind the congressman that the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act was included in the THUD appropriations bill for last year, and it also passed the House in 2019. So that is that cursory tertiary ask, I guess we'll say, for defending the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act's path to passage next Congress. So with that, I just wanted to thank everybody. And again, so the two asks, just to sum it up, so signing on to the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act letter, as well as talking to your congressman that is hopefully in the majority of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee. But thanks so much to everybody for listening to us talk. I hope you received what you asked for with this presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Thanks, Noah. I appreciate that. And maybe we can welcome all of our speakers back on the line and turn on your cameras, and we can do a little bit of Q&A from the audience. So the first question I think should go to Whitney and Andronika. Maybe you could share, what do you think is one of the most important things your local communities can do to prepare now for disasters that might be coming?
Oh, Whitney, I thought you were going to go.
You go.
Okay. One of the things that we have been working on over the last 19 years is exactly the kind of emergency preparedness, muscle building that you're talking about. It's difficult, obviously, because especially if you have people who are still actively in crisis. And what we have learned over the years is that we have to, one, make sure that we are always conducting analysis of the emergency response system, the disaster system, heck, just the general working around affordable housing. So where's rental assistance? What first time homeowner programs exist? What kind of elderly repair programs actually exist so that when people who are in crisis show up, because organizing is the answer. It's getting folks ready to shift power when the opportunity presents itself. And we found that it's really difficult to organize people who are in active crisis around their housing, right? And that's who will show up. We don't benefit from the housing work that we all do, does not benefit from the same kind of interest that climate change, healthcare advocacy, reproductive rights advocacy benefits from, where, yes, you're going to have people who are directly affected, but you're also going to have people who just see a wrong and want to help address it. In this country, we still are not quite at the place where we're ready to guarantee housing for all. And so the people who show up most frequently are the people who are actively in crisis. So we have to actually help them navigate broken systems and hope that they will come back to fight to change those systems. That's for us is and so that means pushing when necessary to make, when there are dollars available, when there is a crisis, making sure that mutual aid as well as emergency responders and some FEMA are doing what they need to do, and we can call them out when they're not. But also long-term, having folks understand that there are decision makers who we have empowered, who will come back every 4 years or every 6 years or every 2 years, depending on what level of office they are at, and they're going to ask you for their vote, and you should say, well, why didn't you help me with my housing? And understand that they have made that difficult with the decisions that they have made. So that is what we're doing. It's slow, hard work, obviously, because again, you're talking about folks who are actively struggling.
I absolutely agree that the community outreach and community education part of preparedness is so important and so necessary. If you have any involvement in the disaster world already, stay in there and keep using your voice, whatever that voice may look like. And then I think one of the other parts of it could just be getting your paperwork together. Whenever a disaster hits, do you have your documentation as far as proving your identity whenever you apply for FEMA? The ownership of your home or a lease agreement if you're a renter, your occupancy, those are some of the big things that FEMA will pop an initial like denial letter over to an applicant is you haven't proven identity, ownership, occupancy. So getting those paperwork things together, as well as estate planning. I know that it's not always fun to think about us leaving our family and friends behind, but what I tell my clients is, if you don't have a plan for your estate, the state of Kentucky has a plan for you. So take control over that and make sure you've got a will, power of attorney, and some of those other things knocked out, because tomorrow's never promised, disaster or not. So yes, definitely get your paperwork in order too.
Thanks for both of those answers, Andronika and Whitney. Noah, I have a question for you. A lot of today's conversation focused on disaster response and recovery, but you mentioned at the top of the call that we've been doing more work around resilience. Could you share a little bit more about, is the DHRC a place where people can be talking about resiliency? And maybe you can give us a sense of what that looks like, since that's new for the coalition to be focusing on explicitly.
That's a good question. I also just wanted to call out, I'm going to steal the, like, if you don't have a plan, the state's got a plan for you and you're not going to like it. Because I think that also even encompasses just pre-disaster planning, writ large, right? So it's like if your community doesn't have a plan, they got a plan. But yeah, to the point of resiliency, I think, we're talking a bit outside the scope of just kind of disaster response, of just like of kind of recovering, just like assistance programs to ensure transitional housing, transition into longer term housing and like that sort of thing. And not because that's not important, because as Angelica said, it's like you have to meet the immediate needs of the people. Like you got to do that. You can't, your organizing effort won't work if those needs are not getting met. But like this is almost like pre-disaster talking about, it's like, okay, so NLHC has done studies that show households with lower incomes are more likely to live in areas at the most risk of the impacts of a disaster. So knowing that, what are we going to do about that before a disaster even happens? And so that might be things like flood mitigation, where we're building parks or green infrastructure and like that sort of thing. Can also mean making buildings more resilient. Might mean like educating people at the household level about what they can do to make sure their house is less damaged during a disaster. And it also can be kind of structural things about like thinking about how government programs prior to a disaster, are utilized by the community. And it's like, I know there's been issues with property values and flooding and that sort of thing. So kind of getting at that level as well, or that aspect of it as well. So it's just kind of talking about it more holistically and less going just from disaster to disaster to disaster, but thinking like, how are we going to not necessarily weather the next disaster, but the 5 disasters down the line.
So appreciate that. I think I really enjoyed today's national call. I hope all of you on the line get a lot of good information about what's the 101 about disaster recovery, where can you start your advocacy work, how you can tap into the resources that we have here at the Coalition. And I want to thank all of our speakers for joining. As a reminder, we're going to share a copy of the presentation and the PowerPoint and all of these resources with you this week. And if you have a chance, please sign on to the letter supporting the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act and call your members of Congress to oppose the House bill that would undermine long-term disaster recovery. And with that, I'll close today's call. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thanks, everybody.